we have the pleasure on this evening's Curated Cribs to have our host, Brian Sieveking. He's a painter, educator, and printmaker who lives and works in Roanoke, Virginia. As a part of the Mountain Lake Workshop from the mid-1980s to 1994, he worked closely with the renowned folk artist, Howard Finster. He worked on projects including documentaries, workouts, the Virginia Film Festival, and a series of unique serigraphic prints published here in Roanoke. Those prints are held in collections of major institutions such as the Whitney Museum of American Art, as well as the Taubman Museum of Art. As a folk art collector, curator, scholar, he's studied, written extensively about, and worked closely with artists such as Finster, Georgia Blizzard, Mose Tolliver, and James Harold Jennings. He's collaborated with institutions such as the National Museum of American Art and the Folk Art Society of America, where he serves on the board of directors. Brian's artwork is held in public and private collections in 14 states and 7 countries. He's a lifelong collector and researcher of Southern folk art and has curated, lectured, and written extensively on the subject. Our museum is very proud of Brian's decades-long partnership. So since the 1980s, Brian served in countless roles, from community connector, working with sister institutions and connecting artists, a staff member, exhibiting artist, educator, and curator. Most recently as adjunct curator of folk and outsider art for the 2016 exhibition, Happy Birthday, Howard, The Amazing World of the Reverend Howard Finster. And we have a few images of that installation that we can share with you all. And I think, Brian, you mentioned that that giant Coke bottle was one of your favorite pieces in the installation. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that Coke bottle, Coke gave it to Howard really in the late 80s. And I think they just gave it to him because they thought it would be sort of a good advertisement there in the garden, but Howard completely painted it. And it disappeared from the garden towards the end of the 1990s. And when I found out that Thomas Scanlon, who was lending stuff to the exhibition, owned that Coke bottle, I mean, I just came, to the people in charge at the Taubman and said, we have to bring this Coke bottle up here. And they were good enough to pay to ship it up to Virginia, so.
We tried very hard for that Coke sponsorship.
Yeah.
And a few more installation shots. We're going to actually tour through 2 different spaces in his studio. So we'll look at the back room, which is more of a display exhibition kind of gallery space. And then we'll go into his studio space where he is right now. So we have a video to share with you of introducing the overarching themes of his collection. And then we'll go into spotlights of different artists. And so this is going into the back room. And Brian, if you would share with us what we're looking at.
Well, essentially, since I don't have Wi-Fi at my studio purposely, because I don't need streaming movies in my working space, I took these videos of the back room, which is where at any given time about 30% of my collection is. The work that's up in my house, it's too complicated to go up and down stairs and step over furniture and things. So I took a bunch of stuff out of boxes and out of storage. And this back room is where work that's going to other institutions to be exhibited. This is where I pack it up and unpack it when it comes back. This is where I take things when they come into the collection. And I try to rotate things in my house so that I don't get, the work doesn't lose its magic, for want of a better word. So at any given time, there's about, as I said, between 30 and 35% of the collection back there. So we're going to look at a lot of the pieces that are back there. We're going to look at paintings, pottery, weird giant gorilla heads from the Natural Bridge. We aren't really going to look at much wood carving because frankly we ran out of time, but there's some East Kentucky wood carving here and some West Virginia wood carving.
And so Brian, when we were doing, if we can pause the video, when we were doing our live call with you, one of the interesting things that really caught my eye was that weird gorilla head that you just glazed over. You actually curated an exhibition at the museum of Mark Klein's work. And so I'd like to share that as well. It's some familiar pieces that some of us would recognize.
Well, the giant gorilla head is, of course, by Mark Klein, who has a studio, a very large studio out in Natural Bridge, and then has Escape from Dinosaur Kingdom 2, the roadside attraction, out in Natural Bridge, which is pretty much internationally known now. And one of the areas of folk art that I'm very interested in are those roadside attractions, and particularly dinosaur parks. And Mark is one of the great dinosaur park builders in the United States. And he did the show at the Taubman. There's the Tyrannosaurus plucking the Union officer off of his horse that was in the atrium that had to be moved in and out for weddings, even though, you know, if I was having a wedding reception, I would have left that dinosaur there. That's the only reason you're going to look at those wedding pictures. But I guess about 3 years ago, I was visiting Mark, and he had just taken down an attraction that had been up in Virginia Beach probably for about 30 years. It started out as Professor Klein's Monster Museum. And then when Back to the Future was a big hit, yeah, that's how long it was up there. It was Professor Klein's Time Machine. And then when Pirates of the Caribbean became a big hit, it was Professor Klein's Pirate Adventure. And he would change the displays in the attraction. And that gorilla was the only thing that was in there for the entire run. It's a big King Kong head. And I visited his studio, and I walked in, and there was a giant pile of pirates just in the middle of the studio. And then that gorilla head was there, and there was an 8-foot tall Cyclops. And I'm very proud of myself for not buying the Cyclops, which I'm sure would just be rotting in my backyard now. But I asked him about that gorilla head, and he said he had to offer it to the guy who was coming to buy the pirates. But if he didn't take it along with the pirates, he would sell me that King Kong head. And so that's really one of Mark's first pieces. And there's the King Kong that was out on the balcony of the Taubman. Coincidentally, when the really violent windstorms that have flowed through the Roanoke Valley for the last, few years started, I was actually really scared for that entire exhibit that King Kong was going to blow off that balcony. But fortunately, Mark and Jim both know how to anchor a giant gorilla.
So they're made out of fiberglass, weighing about, is it fiberglass, right?
Yeah, that big King Kong probably weighs 120 pounds, maybe. I mean, he's very bulky when you're trying to move him, but he doesn't weigh that much. The gorilla head that's in the back room, because I'm trying to figure out where to hang it, he actually weighs about 25 or 30 pounds, because it was a really early piece when Mark was using fiberglass and plaster. And so he's got a heavier, more complicated substructure. But the more recent things, that King Kong, which is also a fairly old piece, but when Mark started building the really big pieces, he's easy to move. I mean, he's moved up and down 81 several times over the last 10 years.
Well, at $1.80, he's lighter than most of us. So.
Yeah, oh yeah.
And
he's available if the Taubman would like him back.
Mary will slap my hand. So let's go back to the video.
Okay. So we're going to start talking about Howard because that's really where the collection started. And it's the largest single holding in the collection. And my art collection really starts with this piece right here. This is the real Brar root art, yes. And Howard came to Ray Cass as part of the Mountain Lake Symposium and workshops, brought Howard to Virginia Tech in 1985. And Howard would come to colleges and do these things that he called workouts, where students could go up. In this case, it was up at what's now the Horton Center, up towards Mountain Lake. And Howard would work with the students, and you could work with his cutouts, his dimensions. And we ended up making a really significant piece of installation art, which is part of the Taubman Museum's collection. Those giant Finster workout boxes that Paul Staples and I put together. And Howard was in Blacksburg for a week. And I drove up initially just to, I'd seen these images that he painted of spaceships. And I'll go see anybody who's seen spaceships. So initially I went up just to sort of, see what this was about, and was just stunned by the amount of work Howard had done, by the amount of energy Howard had, by the way that he could share that energy and share his vision with people. And we had a wonderful week up there. And when it was over, I was the only student who wanted to drive Howard back to Somerville, Georgia. Howard didn't fly, so he needed somebody to drive him back. And we drove him back, and it was just this really life-changing experience. I mean, we drove him to Paradise Garden, which was Howard's installation that he began building after he was either retired or asked to leave a church in Rome, Georgia. There's some debate about that. And it was just this massive construction, with cement sculptures and buildings that Howard had built. Michael Stipe of REM was actually living in the garden at the time that I drove Howard back down there. REM wasn't a big band yet. And Michael Stipe was just kind of hanging out in the garden, practicing being Michael Stipe and absorbing energy from Howard. Howard, on the first full day we were there, took us in the back room where there were about probably 30 pieces of art, and offered to sell us the entire room for $1,000. And I didn't have $1,000 with me, or didn't have $1,000 period, and had been raised by parents who, in the long term, in a good way, had raised me in such a way that I would never take a credit card to a bank and take $1,000 advance on it. I probably should have done that in retrospect, but I ended up smartly just buying 2 pieces instead. And one of them was this piece. And in the long run, I think it worked out, because I think that if I had bought all those pieces, Howard would have seen me as a dealer. And I would have had a very different relationship with Howard over the next really 15 years. But this piece is one of the pieces that I love by Howard, where he would just find objects. It's on a cabinet door, and it's a cut up plastic mirror. And then these roots that he found outside that are attached to it, and he found faces in the roots and named them all. There's one named Cornisol Wigbon. There's, the Coolico gang. And then there's little stories about the people and little bits of sermons about the people on the piece. And this is the kind of work that I just fell in love with, this incredibly inventive, just found object art where Howard could look at anything almost and turn it into a piece of art. And this was the piece I had previously, I mean, I came to art through cartooning and comic book drawing. So I had a couple of pieces of cartoon art and comic book art, but this is where, you know, the official art collecting really began, and certainly where the folk art collecting began.
And I love, so those figures, those are those made out of roots? Is that accurate? Or what are those made
Yeah,
out
I
of?
think they're, Howard always called them briar roots. I think they're briar roots. And he had just glass jars full of them. And when, you know, from time to time, he would just pull them out and look at them and find faces in them and start painting people on them, and then attach them to boards and give them names and write little stories about them. Here's, we're zooming in. Yeah.
And
And,
so
you know,
storytelling was kind of a major part of Howard's work.
absolutely. I mean, there's narratives running throughout his work. Sometimes it's sermons, sometimes it's stories, sometimes it's American history, sometimes it's, you know, Elvis. But the narrative is an important part of Howard's work.
And he was quite prolific as well. I think when you and I were chatting before, was it 50,000?
Yeah, that's
right?
aside from the garden. If we're going to cut over now, aside from the garden, which he began earlier, in the mid 70s, he received a call from God to paint. And he started painting about 1976. This is an early piece, another one of those kind of strange pieces on a piece of found wood with some briar roots attached to it. This is called William McKinley, our third martyred president. And then up here is another of these pieces. I always said these pieces, you know, they're the pieces with mojo. You know, some people call them the kind of creepy pieces, but I find that kind of unfair. This is one that's pot metal art, called Two-Faced Marianne, baby in her arm and head in her hand. And it's melted pot metal art. If you read it, it says metal art by Howard Finster, who can turn anything into something. I bring junk alive to thousands of eyes. And then down at the bottom, it says, no one has to be two-faced. It don't pay. And he would just, you know, melt casting metal in a pan and then drop it out onto the counter and let it cool. And then just like with the briar roots, he would find faces in it, find imagery in it, and then build a story or a sermon around it. And he just made thousands of these pieces. I met him 10 years after he'd started, and he was on piece number 4,800. Now, this is one of the more traditional paintings. This is the second earliest piece that I have. This is piece number 359, and it's called The Pilgrim's Father's First Fields, Promised Land. And Howard would always talk about, Howard was part of the Pentecostal movement that believed that there could be heaven on earth, that there didn't have to be this, you know, apocalypse, this Armageddon. And he felt that America was the land of milk and honey because it was the first country that was completely covered by stores where you could go buy milk and honey. And if you zoom in on this, you can see there's Christopher Columbus before he became, you know, a pariah who nobody's supposed to paint anymore, but he was there as part of American history. I also love those early paintings because Howard does these cameos in them. But as you move across it, you know, it talks about America being the land of milk and honey and the promised land. And then Howard makes this sort of cameo appearance down there in the bottom of the painting, which I always like when he shows up in his paintings. It has one of his custom frames. He really stopped making those custom frames right about 1985. Then if we come all the way down, after that workout, we started making a documentary about Howard. And in order to raise money for the documentary, Ray Cass decided that it would be a good idea to do print. And I was a printmaker, so we sent a big lithographic plate down to Somerville. And Howard had done some prints. He'd done some etchings at the University of Georgia. He'd done some lithographs out in Colorado. And so Ray sent the lithographic plate down, and I went down and picked it up, and Howard had done this really beautiful drawing on it. I mean, it was a 32 by 42 inch drawing. But the problem was it was covered with writing. And if you do engraving, or if you do etching, or if you do lithography, it's a positive to negative printmaking process. So all the people who'd made prints with him before had to sort of artificially and photographically flip all of his writing. So I talked to Howard about it, and I talked to Ray about it. And I went over to Ed Bourdette's screen printing studio when it used to be on Elm Avenue, Art Images, and talked to Ed about it. And we decided to print it as a silk screen because silk screening is positive to positive. Plus, all the earlier prints had been in black and white, and silk screening would let us get Howard's colors. So we actually printed that lithograph onto a sheet of acetate, and then used the acetate to make a silk screen, and then printed a big edition of that Empty Road print. It's at the Taubman. It's in the collection of the Taubman. We did a red one and a blue one and a black and white one. And it was, a fantastic print. It's where I found out that you should never make a print that's bigger than 36 inches in any direction, because it costs a fortune to frame, and it's a really hard sell. But it is a really cool print anyways. And over the course of 87 and 94, about 6 years, we did 15 prints with Howard. And all of them were designed as prints, made as prints, conceived as prints. And it's really an incredible body of work. And once again, it speaks to Howard's sort of continual interest in learning new things and complete grasp of every kind of creative endeavor. Unfortunately, the prints came out so well that lots and lots and lots of people started making prints with Howard. In fact, one day in about 93, I was in my apartment over in Wasena, and a guy from Chicago called me and really delightedly informed me that they were going to do a print of one of our prints. And wasn't that great? And after I explained to him that that was against the law, he decided to make t-shirts instead. But so many people started making prints, and they weren't conceived of as prints. People were just taking existing paintings and color separating them and doing them as 4 colors. And so that whole series of prints with Howard ended in about 1994. And one thing about Howard, anybody who wanted to do something, he was all for it, especially if you were a young person. If you wanted to make posters, if you wanted to make prints, if you wanted to make t-shirts, if you wanted to make ties, if you wanted to make toys, Howard would say, "Oh, do it, go for it." Okay, now this painting is my current favorite in my collection. Well, we're zooming over past it right now. Let's see if we come back. These are a couple more of later paintings, but this is Spud, king of pets, king of dogs. I sort of zoomed in, you can see how handmade it is. It has this multi-level framing on it. Then you come in, it's a whole narrative about this dog that he loved named Spud, who shows up in a lot of his artwork. It was his boyhood dog. And he turned it into this whole painting about, the wonder of dogs and how great dogs are, and how much better the world would be if people shared certain attributes of dogs. If you start zooming in, you can see things like these dogs coming out of the water, and him discussing how dogs all know their masters. If you come over to the boat, it's just things like, people don't give dogs credit a baby dog can swim, but a baby can't swim. And then, of course, there's swimming dogs. Then as you move across, there's dogs, the dogs from the Bible that licked Lazarus's sores. Then that little bulldog that's in sort of the central place, it was for the original commissioners of the painting. That was a dog of theirs that had passed away. So Howard put it into the painting and put it into that little garden area. There's a dog, image of a dog down there from Utah that was feeding and taking care of an orphaned lamb. Then there's images of dogs that are being abused and they don't understand why. It calls into question why people would abuse dogs. So zoom around some more. There's the dog that's taking care of the orphaned lamb and feeding the orphaned lamb in Utah. He did several of these dog paintings. There's one called Dogs of the Bible. There's one called The Story of Dogs, but this is the largest one. It's about 50 inches high. And it just has these wonderful sort of playful images of particularly children with dogs. And then writing about, dogs are grateful for what they're given and thankful for what they're given. If people were more like dogs, they would be grateful. But I love this down here. It just says dogs stand tall in my book. And if you look closely, you can see that giant dog that's shaking hands with it in the house. And this is a fairly early piece. I think it's in the 1600 range. I think it's 1632. But I have a couple of these larger early pieces, and they're just masterpieces. They're incredible pieces of outsider art, but they also speak to traditional folk art. Then if we move over, these are a couple of later pieces from the mid-80s. This is a vision painting where he's talking about a vision he had, where he saw a group of holy people, and he starts speaking to them rather. He says, I had a vision of another world. I privately listened in on these people. They were holy and free of sin, the kind of people I've been looking for all my life. When I stepped out before them, they all ran away because I was a stranger to them. I cried out, hey, I'm Howard Finster. Don't run away. I want to talk to y'all. They are still running and I'm still searching for them. Where did they go? I love them and they love me. So, just like when he's making appearances in those early paintings, I like when he's part of the vision. And then down here, this is a painting right around number 5,000. It's one of his heaven paintings. And Howard told me that this is the first heaven painting where the buildings in heaven are in color. And there's kind of white mountains and then, the many mansions where people are living. And then there's colored clouds in the background. Howard made about 5,000 pieces between 1975 and 1985. And then between 1985 and 2000, he made another 45,000 pieces. And that's while he was working on the garden. So he was amazingly and compulsively creative.
And the garden was a space that he utilized to also connect artists with others. And so one of the ones that we were talking about was Jimmy Lee Sutton. And we have a little bit of a focus on your collection of that art as well that we would like to share.
Yeah, Jimmy Lee was in Alabama, in Fayette, Alabama, or Canes Ridge, Alabama, depending on which side of that argument you want to go to. And when you visited Howard, there would be addresses of other artists and images by other artists.
And the garden was a space that he utilized to also connect artists with others. And so one of the ones that we were talking about was Jimmy Lee Sutton. And we have a little bit of a focus on your collection of that art as well that we would like to share.
Yeah, Jimmy Lee was in Alabama, in Fayette, Alabama, or Canes Ridge, Alabama, depending on which side of that argument you want to go to. And when you visited Howard, there would be addresses of other artists and images by other artists and, telephone numbers. And so one of the first artists I met through Howard was Jimmy Lee Sutton, who was this amazing, sort of ageless, ancient man from Alabama who painted. He started painting when he was a little kid, but he really seriously started painting in the 60s when his wife became ill and he had to stay close to their house to take care of her. And his mother had been an herbal healer. So as a small child, he went out with his mother while she collected plants and roots and various things for the community. And he started using these things to make colors with, because they couldn't afford paint. And so he began to paint these pictures on scrapboard and scrap items. And really beginning in the early 70s, started to gain attention and gain a national following. He painted with dirt and different kinds of soil and ground up plants. He also used house paints. And then as binders, he would use sap and mud and Coca-Cola and caulk. And so this is one of the earlier pieces I have by him. It's actually on a sample board from a custom RV specialist in Fayette. And whenever they got in a new shipment of sample boards with samples of upholstery or samples of fabrics, they would just dump all the old ones at Jimmy Lee's house and he would start painting on them. And he would paint just these intense images of animals, of people in the community, of buildings in the community, of buildings from his memory. And he painted almost entirely with his fingers and with sticks and with sponges. And he has this really fascinating formal approach to application. And there's a tendency to not pay attention to how these people worked as artists. But if you zoom in on this piece, and I think if you speed it up just a little, I zoom in on it, you can start to see just how intensely he worked these surfaces. I mean, every little mark, it's just built layer upon layer upon layer of mud and house paint and caulk. And there's a tendency to dismiss these people as, thinking artists, to just look at the images and just consider them as personalities. But whether it was Howard or Jimmy Lee or Mose Tolliver, they really were actively engaged in the painting process at a level that any studio artist is. They did paint compulsively and they tended to repeat subjects, but Claude Monet painted compulsively and tended to repeat subjects. And he would build upon the traditional subjects. This is another dog painting. This is his dog Toto. I visited him across about 15 years, and I would say that there were 5 different iterations of Toto. They lived very close to a road, so every time you went down, there was a new Toto. But he would paint just his dog over and over and over again. And these paintings have this amazing expressive quality. And the paintwork, once again, on this Toto, it's very simple use of color, but it's a very sophisticated use of simple color. And when you really get in on it, you can look at this paint application and you can look at the intensity with which he would work these surfaces. And he worked with different grounds. He worked with just leaving the wood blank. He worked with white grounds, he worked with neutral grounds, he worked with these black grounds. And Jimmy Lee, in a lot of ways, when he's really on, I think he's the best pure painter of the painters who were in this folk art outsider movement. This is a painting of people dancing, vertical painting, one of his memory paintings. and really expressive, really interesting use of space, and really intense, almost manic application of the paint to the surface. You start zooming in, it's sort of like that scene in Ferris Bueller where they zoom in on the face of the figure in Seurat's, Grand Jatte painting. And Jimmy Lee really, really understood his materials and was interested in the painting process, very much engaged in it. In fact, he was so engaged in the painting process that some of his paintings start to offer kind of interesting conservation problems to the people in the institutions that own them. And this is my conservation issue. This is one of my favorite pieces in the collection, and it's one of my favorite Jimmy Lee Sutton paintings ever. It's a giant gingerbread man. And I'm going to zoom in a minute. This thing is so thick. It's the thickest painting that he ever did. It's entirely mud and caulk, and it's built on top of a chicken wire substructure. And I like it on many, many, many levels. I mean, for one thing, it's sort of an interesting combination of Jean Dubuffet and Art Brut, and then high modernism, this kind of action painting application, and Jimmy Lee Sutton. And as you can see, I worry every week that I'm going to walk in and find this thing just laying on the floor of the back room. It's actually been amazingly inert. Those cracks in it are actually filled with paint. I mean, he laid it out in the sun and let it crack and then started painting on it. So it's got those glass eyeballs, and then when you zoom in, you can start to see how the paint goes down into those crevices. And he was very, very involved with the surface. But it's one of those pieces, I don't lend it anymore. The last time it was in the show was at the Taubman, I guess about 10 years ago. And I look at it all the time. I talk to people like Mary about it. And there's a big debate as this work has become more and more accepted. I mean, it's being shown now, it's part of the collection of the Metropolitan Museum and the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And in the biggest when pigs fly moment ever, the Virginia Museum is actually showing it as well and collecting it as well. But there's going to be, and there already is starting to be a debate about what can you do to it conservationally. I mean, I would really love to fix this surface with a plastic coating, but I haven't done it because there's that whole issue of, are you fundamentally changing the piece of art when you polychrome it?
And
we'll see.
I can imagine with that the demon dog that you would eventually have just a pile of dirt on your floor.
Well, I'm shocked. I have never had to clean up dirt in front of me. So he did know what he was doing, but yeah, it's, it really needs to be sprayed with something that I'm waiting for more official people than I to decide what this stuff can be sprayed with. Because, I mean, I don't have a tremendous amount of money invested in that Gingerbread Man, because I don't think anybody but me wanted it, because everybody was afraid it was just going to fall off the board in a couple of hours. But the work's becoming, as it becomes more accepted and more collectible and more sort of officially art, it's rapidly becoming more valuable. And so people are going to have to start thinking about these making it last issues.
And we did a little bit of kind of an overview when we went into your backroom space, and you have quite a bit of pottery. And so I want us to kind of go into the really artists that piqued your curiosity and passion for ceramics.
Yeah, also through Howard, because I went to a show at Sieveking in Winston-Salem that Howard was in, and there was work there by this potter from Virginia named Georgia Blizzard. And Ray Cass and I drove down to visit Georgia, who lived in Chilhowie, Virginia. Well, she lived in Glade Spring, which is between Chilhowie and Saltville, which I'm sure everybody knows exactly where that is. If you want a wider suggestion, it's between Marion and Abingdon down in southwestern Virginia. And Georgia just made these amazing hand-built figure pots. Once again, she started making them as a child. Georgia was half Scotch-Irish and half Native American. Her grandfather actually was brought to Cherokee, North Carolina from an Indian reservation in the West, a Navajo Apache Indian reservation, so that the people who ran this Indian attraction in Cherokee would have an actual, Native American there on site. This is at the turn of the 19th and 20th century, early 20th century. And so he was Georgia's grandfather, and Georgia was one of 4 sisters, 2 of whom had reddish blonde hair and blue eyes and very fair skin, and 2 of whom had dark brown eyes and olive skin and jet black hair. And the 4 of them, but really Mary and her sister, Georgia and her sister May, started making these pots very early. And they, from the beginning, had this sort of pre-Columbian feel to them. But her father, who was a very tortured man on a lot of levels about his background and his heritage, didn't like them making those weird Indian pots. And so would throw them in the water and made them destroy them all. But in the 1960s, these, let's call them entrepreneurs in southwestern Virginia, found Georgia and had her begin to make fake Native American, pre-Columbian Indian pots. They were sort of salting recreational digs in Southwest Virginia so that everybody who was doing a dig could find a pot. And so Georgia was one of several artisans in Southwest Virginia who worked making these copies of Indian pots that were in catalogs of Native American work. But by the 70s, she really started just working on her own pieces and building her own body of work. They're almost all memory pots of people that she knew. I think the very first pot that I got from Georgia is that sort of small one that has its arm up to its face. It's called Oh My, What Have I Done? Where Am I? And then she would build those small, really, really sort of beautiful, expressive pots. And then started working on, more major pieces. This is one of the early pieces. This is an Indian pipe. And there's actually a long folk art in Southwest Virginia of making fake Indian pottery and fake Indian artifacts, which is something that interests me in the history of folk art, which is technically George's personal work. Those hand-built pots aren't official folk art. But all of the fake Indian artifacts that were made in Southwest Virginia, if you take the official definition of folk art, which is a long-standing traditional art that's passed down from generation to generation and has an economic impact on the community, making fake Indian artifacts is a real Virginia folk art, officially, by definition.
Quite ironic. And you would think that, these pieces, they're absolutely beautiful, but they're not something that you would buy as a tourist, as what she was hired for doing.
No, in fact, there are several institutions that want to do a Georgia Blizzard show, and eventually it goes to someone who just looks at it and goes, we aren't going to sell many T-shirts or posters with these on them. No. But for instance, that pot that's central right now, it's called My Friend Pepe. And it looks like it has these sort of pre-Columbian decorations on it, But that face is actually a friend of hers named Joe, who I met after I had the pot. And the second I saw him, I knew that that was Pepe. I knew that that was who that pot was. I mean, obviously his head wasn't quite that big in proportion to his body, but she had this ability to capture, the essence of people and the essence of just situations. The pot that I'm sort of panning over to a little bit is a self-portrait pot. That's a jug of her called a thing called Age, where she's the central figure there on the top, and then at the bottom there are flowers, which are actually flowers in a cemetery. And she wasn't about making cute art. And one thing that is absolutely true of these artists is, they weren't about making tourist objects. I mean, they were serious artists who were, working with serious issues in their own lives, their own communities, really in the country as a whole. And so when Georgia makes a self-portrait, it's not idealized and it's not prettied up. And when you zoom in, you can see, these flowers that she sees as graveside flowers. And if you go around to the side of the pot, here are worms that are coming to devour her. This is very much a pot about her feeling her age and her feeling her mortality. And on the back of it, there's a poem called A Thing Called Age. So she wrote poems, she wrote songs, she made pots, and she lived this remarkable life for someone who almost never left Bladesburg, Virginia. I remember her once talking about songs she had written, and when I asked her what happened to the songs, she said, well, when Joan Baez came down in the early 70s, she gave Joan Baez all the songs. And she would always sort of drop these grenades of information into discussion.
Oh, that's funny. Well, I do want to take some time where we can actually get into your work. So, the museum has a number of your pieces in our permanent collection, some earlier works from the early 90s, and we'd like to pull up the screen share on those works, and we can talk a little bit about the evolution of your practice.
Okay. Well, as I said earlier, I mean, visiting Howard was just this sort of great moment of revelation for me, because the first night I was there, I went into the chapel, which was where you stayed if you were down there. And he had done these paintings on the lids of paint cans. And they were just these little lids of paint cans. And he had painted Eli Whitney's face on one, and then he painted Eli Whitney's wife on the other one. And they just sort of at once delighted me and frustrated me, because, I was a kid, but I was doing what I thought was important art. I was painting these giant paintings that were full of really, violent imagery. And I was coming at it from cartooning and from comic books. And the first, sort of high art that I really loved was German Expressionist art. So I was doing these really giant paintings about, the political situation in South America, which, I knew so much about because I'd read an article in Rolling Stone. And so I was just looking at these little paintings on these paint cans, thinking, why are these things good? I mean, they're really good, but I couldn't really understand why they were really good. I mean, they weren't big and they weren't yelling at you, and they weren't about Nicaragua or El Salvador. And I spent a lot of time thinking about it. And the next morning, Howard came in, and I said, why did you paint Eli Whitney? And he said, well, I was reading about Eli Whitney, and I thought he was a really great man. He did a lot of really cool stuff, so I painted him. And then I thought his wife must have had to put up with a lot of stuff to be married to Eli Whitney, so I thought his wife needed to be painted as well. And of course, eventually I realized that that had a whole lot to do with Howard and his wife, and how much Pauline, his wife, had to put up with being married to Howard Finster. But there was just this moment where I was like, you mean you're allowed to paint stuff that you're interested in? It doesn't have to be some great important statement, that yells the same thing over and over again in people's faces. And it really was through meeting Howard that I started painting what I was interested in, which was essentially that period in pop culture before it became fully corporatized. It really starts in the 1930s, but kicks into high gear right after World War II. And it really only lasts until the mid 60s or right around 1970. But there's this moment in American history where all of the sort of real weird American culture kind of came to the top. And, they started recording, these weird combinations of black and white music and, folk music and popular music that it's not like no one recorded it earlier, but it wasn't really released on as large a scale. Country and R&B and the blues, and they became these major cultural forces, largely because for the first time, the vast majority of the American public had money to buy things with. And so there's this moment in Black culture where there's this interesting, in American culture, where there's this interesting conflagration of African American culture and European American culture and Latin American culture, and things just sort of bleed into each other and bump into each other. And I'm aware that it was a really horrible time in history as well, to a large extent, but there was also this sort of cross influence that hadn't been made palatable yet, that hadn't been made for the suburbs yet. And I'm really interested in that, whether it's sports or music or movies or literature. And that's really what I started making art about. I just started making art about the stuff that interested me when I was a kid, and that interested me when I was a young adult, and that still interests me.
We see that influence now, and this is a more current piece from a series you're working on. Is that accurate for Natural Bridge?
Yeah, when I first started painting seriously, it was much more expressionistic and much more loose and much, much larger. And over time, it's become tighter and smaller and a little bit more personal. And really, about 10 years ago, I started incorporating sort of a longer view of American history, and I started doing paintings that sort of combined the style and the imagery of 19th century American painting with these characters that had sort of populated my paintings since I first started painting seriously. And so I would do things like build a painting around Edward Hicks' Peaceable Kingdom paintings, only much more refined and much, more modeled and naturalistic than Edward Hicks. And then I would bring in portions of different paintings that's not Edward Hicks' Natural Bridge back there. It's another 19th century painting of Natural Bridge. And then I would replace Baby Liberty with Baby Elvis. And, there's a whole little group of ghosts there to the left, which are great early American musicians. I think the Carter family is back there, and Bessie Smith is back there. and Lightnin' Hopkins is back there, and Jimmy Rogers and Rosetta Tharpe. And then there's Edward Hicks creatures moving about, but there's also James Audubon creatures. There's also, just because I like it so much, that lamb is actually the lamb from Van Eyck's Lamb of God, the Ghent altarpiece. But they sort of became these conglomerations of images and ideas from really all American history instead of that much more specific part. And there were a whole lot of these paintings, paintings based on Copley paintings, paintings based on Winslow Homer paintings, paintings based on, I even made engravings and etchings, of famous events like I took that Boston Massacre painting, but replaced it with the Greensboro Massacre. I took a painting of Tarleton, the British officer who sort of terrorized Georgia and the Carolinas, and then was defeated, down in the battle in Greensboro, North Carolina. And there was a giant there called Peter Colombo, who was the revolutionary giant. He was a man who was like 7 feet tall, who went out on the battlefield. And so I took that image of Colombo defeating Tarleton, only I replaced him with Haystack Calhoun, the wrestler. So they just embraced a wider swath of American history, for want of a better description.
And so when we were chatting earlier, and it's interesting how this progression has come about, and now it's the Viewmaster. So like those little Viewmasters that you put the slides in and you click them through, that's your current inspiration for your work. And so we just have a little bit of time to share what you've been working on now, and then we can open up to Q&A.
Okay. Well, these came about specifically because of COVID and the fact that I couldn't paint with oil paint for more than a year now. And I was pretty much finishing up those, 19th century American paintings with pop figure paintings anyways, but I was getting ready to start on a new group of oil paintings, but I wash my hands compulsively. Plus, I have to use Turps when I'm painting with oils. Plus, I was constantly using hand sanitizer. So those three things don't mix well at all. I mean, when I'm working on oil paintings anyways, when I'm intensely working on them, even though I use things like painter's glove, my skin tends to crack on my hands. And so with COVID, that just became impossible. And so I just started doing lots and lots of little drawings initially. And then I started doing little ink and watercolor paintings. And at some point, I found this image that I was fascinated by when I was a little kid from the GAF Viewmaster. It's that dinosaur image. And I had this little, I think most people are familiar with them. I had one of those little reels that went in the Viewmaster, and it had dinosaurs on it. But it had actually belonged to my oldest sister. They actually quit making that particular reel before I was born. So I could never find this image again after it got thrown away, or I lost it, or whatever happened to it. But I found that image and did a little painting of it. And next to it was an image from a Star Trek Viewmaster. So I did a little painting of the Star Trek Viewmaster. And then I found a Dracula Viewmaster. So I did a little painting of that. And then the Frankenstein. And then I had one that I think was Disneyland, because I think it predated Disney World. But I was doing things like Cinderella's Castle and the Haunted Mansion. And so over the last several months, really almost a year, I've done about 80 of these little ink and watercolor paintings of Viewmaster frames. And I'm about to start doing large-scale oil paintings of about 20 of them. And I'm planning in my head slowly an installation that's going to include the oil paintings, but also a lot of photographed images and projected images. And it's going to play with depth, because there's this really interesting false 3D effect that was created by Viewmasters. And so for the last several months, and I'm sure for the next year or so, I'm just going to be obsessively contemplating Viewmaster images, and hopefully it turns into something really interesting. If not, I'm just going to have a bunch of 10 by 10 inch watercolor paintings of Viewmaster frames.
Well, that's
But that's how
exciting.
art works. It's not like I'm compulsive like those folk artists that I collect.
For most of the art that you've collected, Brian, is it all through personal connection, or do you collect outside of that?
Initially, it was all through personal connections. I mean, I went from Howard to Mose Tolliver, to Jimmy Lee, to Mary T. Smith. I mean, you could always build on your experience through the information Howard had at the garden, but also through people like Ray Cass and like Roger Manley, who was one of the early and is still one of the great experts on this art, who runs the Great Museum down at NC State. And I would just meet people, and I had really wonderful relationships with most of these people. I mean, most of them were very friendly and very interested, particularly in young people who were interested in their work. Through Georgia, I became very interested in pottery. And more recently, I've been concentrating on collecting pottery. Most of the people, when I met them, were in their 70s and 80s. So all of them, even Jimmy Lee, who lived to be 97, are gone now. And so now most of the collecting I do is through trading and through auctions and through gallery purchases.
Great. Well, it was lovely touring through your spaces and hearing. It's a pleasure to hear from you, Brian.